Oh, look who snuggled up to me on the couch. Great stuff. Thanks, JP. Our guest today has been looking after the affairs of leading AFL players for a long time. He's pivotal to negotiations for the players' cut of what has become a huge revenue pool for the game. He's a leading voice in what is becoming a big debate about the impact of concussion on footballers, and he's a tough negotiator whose name makes club bean counters start trembling. Welcome to the show, Peter Jess.
Thank you, Ro.
Very immaculately dressed. I didn't know our show had so much cred.
Well, it does. I'm here just to show it off for you, mate.
All right, well, for people that perhaps aren't as familiar with your work, it's been a long, long time, and I know you've got some great stories, but just tell us about how you initially got involved. Your cousin, of course, was the great Jim Jess, Richmond centre-half forward, and I believe you were of the belief that they were sort of paying him a pittance and you were in a position to do something about it.
Well, Jim was the first client that I worked for, and was by default. Jim came and asked me, he said, well, this is what I'm getting paid. What do you think? Prior to that, his dad had done it, and his dad had signed him up for 10 grand a year. And so I looked at it. I looked at the currency of the players that were round, and John Patura sprung to mind, and John was getting paid 120 grand. And so I said to Jim, well, look, what we'll do is we'll walk in there and we'll say that we want $100,000 a year. But before we do that, we need to go and talk to a few clubs to make sure that if they do pull the trigger, we've got somewhere to go. So I went and spoke to Colo. And
at Carlton, Ian Collins?
Yeah, Ian Collins. And so I got Colo to sign up a letter to say that if Jimmy came to Carlton through whatever means, and he'd be paid X dollars, which is a little bit more than what he got paid at the Tigers. But so Jim was happy with that. We went down and met the club. There was GR, Graham Richmond, Kevin Dixon, Octa Wilson, and Kit Carson, the used car salesman, and they're all sitting around. And so Jim and I walked in, and GR led off and said, well, Jimmy, what do you want? And before Jimmy could open his mouth, I said, 100,000. And GR sort of looked at me, and Octa Wilson was about to jump over the desk and strangle me. And so we had a bit of a laugh. And anyway, they said, well, no, let's talk serious. What do you really want? And I said, 100. And they said, Jimmy, is this what you want? And Jimmy's nodded. Didn't say much, he just nodded. Yeah. So GR turned to Jimmy. He said, Jimmy, if you want 100, you can fuck off now. So I said, okay, Jim, let's go. So we stood up. We walked out. There was a bit of a thing. I said, and by the way, I've already spoken to Colo. So anyway, so there was a bit of a huddle, and GR said, okay, all right, come in. So we walked back in, and there's a bit of a discussion. He said, you sure it's 100? I said, yeah, definitely, 100, or else we're up the road. And so, GR's turned to Ghost, and he said, Jimmy, we'll pay you 100 on one condition. And Jimmy said, what's that? He said, GR said, never ever bring this fucking little prick back into this joint ever again. So that was me.
Well, I'd just like to apologise to the folks at home for the use of the phrase used car salesman. We're going to get into some hot topics of the day, but just like off the top of your head, who would be the biggest 5 players you've managed over the years?
I'd say the best 2 would be Gary Ablett Sr.
Yeah, not bad.
And Greg Williams.
Yeah, give you that.
Closely followed then by the Madden brothers.
Yeah.
Earl the Pearl.
Earl Sporting.
Yep. And a plethora of others.
No, it's a fair. I was just trying to give people a sense of the sort of names you've been involved with.
Pete, you've been at the forefront of raising awareness about concussion. It's obviously exploded again this week with St Kilda forward Paddy McCartan receiving his 3rd head knock for the season. This is what St Kilda coach Alan Richardson had to say about where Paddy's at the moment.
Yeah, look, it's a bit early, really. It'll be up to the doctors and the medicos. They'll do everything necessary to make sure that he's either right to play or not. I haven't actually had an opportunity to chat to the docs at this stage, but it'll just be up to our medical team.
Peter, are you happy with the state of play with how concussion's being treated at the moment, and do you feel there could be a class action down the track?
Which part do I answer first, John?
Both.
So if I said no and yes, and they're not changeable. So am I satisfied with the concussion regime at the moment in the AFL? It's an emphatic no. It's improved, but we still don't have a rapid point of care diagnostic tool that actually can tell us whether a player is hurt or not and the extent of it. Now, there's been research after research throughout the world now with multimodalities, which include blood tests, which include saliva tests, which includes various types of scans. At this stage, there is no club, there is no benchmark throughout the league where this is in situ, to give the players the best chance of being diagnosed and then being treated and then being put into a rehab program. So it's a huge gap. Class action, the second part of your question, I put this proposition to the AFLPA at their last conference. Would they support it? Brett Murphy said he's not sure under what act that you would sue. Well, I can help him. It's called the Wrongs Act, and it's a difficult process because what it is, it's about duty of breach of care. So what we have to establish that the AFL knew and did nothing about it, and if it did know, what it did know, and what did it put in place to make sure the players were safe.
Are there former players out there keen to pursue this?
Look, there's a number of players that I've spoken to who are less than happy with the current circumstances, because basically what happens is because the AFL got the Victorian State Government to change the work cover laws in 1972, professional sportsmen have been excluded from long-term cover under such things as work cover. So effectively what happens when you finish and you're off the list, you're on your own. There's a little bit of support, not great, and it's pretty much as I put it, walking around the ground with a blanket and getting people to feel sorry for you and throw a few bob in. I mean, it's complete nonsense. I mean, one of the things that I've been pushing for is for the change in the legislation, get sportsmen back into the workers' compensation where they should be, and then they get long-term care. The same in terms of the funding for the research into concussion. I mean, I've put it to the AFL that they should have a ticket levy system, and I've been doing this for the last 5 or 6 years, and they refuse to fund the research.
So there clearly needs to be more collaboration between yourself and the AFLPA and the AFL. I mean, is there, how much more ground can there be made up before we really sort of get to the realistic possibility of a class action or a strike or anything of that nature?
Well, I've always been very strong on the fact that, we would have to be in dire straits for a strike to happen, because I think it alienates fans. We've seen it in the US, we've seen it everywhere else. From my point of view, it just shouldn't happen. But it is a legitimate tactic. I think there's other things that they can do, such as in terms of gaming and other things. They can say, well, they're not going to have their image used in gaming, which is a big money spinner, and a whole range of other sort of stuff. But in terms of a class action, I would think that the support for that is very strong. The appetite is that the AFLPA, because it's largely funded by the AFL, there is a lesser degree for them to want to participate in a direct knock them down, punch on with City Hall. But I mean, sooner or later, that may change, but I can't see it in the short term.
I've got another fix, Pete, and that is that every footballer, when he commences his career on a yearly basis, signs a waiver recognising the inherent dangers of a contact sport, and will sign away his right to sue the AFL. Now that might seem to a player manager and to the AFLPA absolute heresy.
No.
It exists in sport. If you want to go in the rodeo, you sign a waiver because you know riding bulls is bloody dangerous.
Yeah.
I'm telling you that if we get too protective of players following their careers as professional sports people playing football, most people who play footy do so not for money, but at risk of exactly the same dangers. Why, if we continue to go down this track, would anybody play football, allow their children to play football, etc.?
Well, I think you can answer that yourself.
The game will die. I'm telling you, the game will die if we're worried about protecting players from contact injuries.
No. Look, it's about having the ability to diagnose and to make the game safe.
Yep.
Now,
that's fair enough.
Once we have, the architecture to ensure the safety of the players via rapid point of care technology pitch side, you can actually then mitigate a whole range of the outcomes that happen with concussion. There was research done in Melbourne by a scientist who had developed a system whereby post-match or or even during the game, you could take a blood test within 20 minutes. They could tell the extent of the concussion and what you needed to do in terms of the treatment regime, whether it be get wrapped in an ice vest, slow down the flow of the blood to your head, the whole range of things. And then she had developed this form of antidote, which means that you could mitigate it from the acute outcomes to actually a mild and nothing. Now, the AFL has steadfastly refused to fund that research, and it's available in Victoria and would be world-leading technology. Why?
Just on another issue, Peter, you look after Nathan Lovett-Murray, who's been seeking compensation from Essendon for the 2012 supplements program.
Yep.
Where are things at in terms of the compensation? Do you fear this will drag on into 2017?
Well, sensible people need to come together very quickly. This has dragged on way too long. There hasn't been a process up to now whereby claims can be looked at in a sensible commercial outcome. I mean, I think the biggest issue is this, that the club hasn't recognised the extent of the damage that they've caused to players. They really haven't got a real good handle on that. I mean, it is quite frightening. I mean, whilst the club now is trying to do the right thing, it really hasn't shown full contrition to what has actually happened to these players and their families.
What's the total potential exposure for Essendon? How much end game could this cost the Essendon Football Club?
Look, that's a very good question, and I'm surprised it's come from you, Finey, but anyway, we'll press on. I think it's in layers, because there are players who are going back to the club and they will sacrifice the real value of the damages to be part of the club going forward, and it'll probably be rolled up into their next gig. There are other players who have left the club, excuse me, and they will have a different view. And then there are players who have retired and who have been excluded from getting jobs as coaches. In terms of quantum, I would think, that it would be not out of the realms of somewhere between 30 million plus.
That's good news. I'm an Essendon supporter. We've got to wrap it up there, unfortunately. But just before we go, we did drag up an old clip from the archives. You're not averse to a stoush, and you've had a few over the years. But one of the most entertaining ones I remember was over Nicky Winmar's renegotiation of a contract back in 1993. You appeared on a Sunday footy show, and you had a fair old sparring match with, believe it or not, Ian Molly Meldrum.
Now, how are you or Stephen Dunn going to break an AFL contract that is there for 2 years. How can you assure that player that you'll have him in a November draft? Because believe me, I spoke to Stephen Dunn on Friday night. He said he won't come back to St Kilda and we'll have him in a new club by November. How are you going to do it?
Well,
are you bigger than the AFL contract? I know you've done some pretty amazing things in your life, mate, but are you bigger than the AFL contract?
Well, I don't think that is the issue.
Well, of course it's the damn issue.
Well, if I can have my say.
Well, please.
Thank you.
You're not saying much at the moment.
All right. Well, because you're opening your slapper. I take the piss, mate.
Looking pretty dapper there, Pete. I think I preferred those glasses to these ones, actually.
Yeah, well, look, that was going back a few years, right? I put on a few pounds in the wrong places.
Only the mullet survived.
The mullet
You got
survives
the deal
just.
sorted in the end?
Sorry?
You obviously got the deal sorted with Winmar in the end.
Yeah, look, I think culturally it just exposed the club and the league to just how far away that they didn't get the whole gamut of what he was talking about. What had happened, they said to him is that if you perform well during the year and you finish in the top 3 best and fairest, we will increase your pay to X dollars. Nicky took them at his word, at their word, and then went back in and said, well, you promised me that you would pay me. And there was a collective sigh in the room as if somebody just flattened a tyre, and you could say, well, yeah, we did tell you, but, you know, but you're Nicky Winmar. You don't really expect to get paid that, do you? And he said, well, you know, via us. We said, well, yeah, really? So you should pay him, or else, you know, obviously he then needs to wonder whether, in fact, you're looking after him in the best way. I mean, you can't promise somebody that you're going to do something, and then at the end of the season, he's performed at a very good level, come to him and say, well, yes, we did promise you, but we've changed our mind.
I think it was worth playing that clip just to hear Molly Meldrum speaking articulately without mumbling. Unfortunately, nothing to do with music. Maybe he should have been in the footy media rather than the music media. Great stuff, Pete. Really fascinating chat, and I'm sure we'll be hearing a lot more about several of those topics you covered.
Stepping out!